The command hall at Redstone Valley Military Base held 400 soldiers that morning. They all watched Colonel Marcus Kane cross the floor and strike a junior logistics officer across the face with an open hand. The crack of it echoed off the concrete walls. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And the woman standing there, blood at the corner of her mouth, hands completely still at her sides, did not flinch. She did not apologize. She did not step back. She just looked at him. And that look made 3 senior officers in the back row feel something they couldn't name. Something cold. If you're new here, subscribe before this story is over. Drop your city or country in the comments right now so I can see exactly how far this reaches. Hit like, stay with me, because what happens inside that base will change everything you think you know about power, rank, and the cost of underestimating the wrong person. The transfer order arrived on a Tuesday in late October, buried inside a standard administrative packet that the duty clerk at Redstone Valley Military Base stamped without reading past the 3rd line. Personnel transfer, Logistics Support Division. Reporting Officer, Cross, E. Rank, First Lieutenant. Specialty, Supply Chain Coordination. Effective date, 0600, November 3rd. 4 lines. No commendations attached. No specialized training record flagged. The deployment history field was present but vague in a way that suggested either an unremarkable career or careful redaction, and nobody at Redstone Valley had the time or inclination to figure out which. They had their own problems. The base had been running for 2 years under a pressure that wasn't loud enough to be called a crisis, but was constant enough to have changed the way people moved through the corridors. Careful movements, eyes that checked doors before they spoke. The particular kind of institutional silence that descends on a place where people have learned that saying the wrong thing to the wrong person carries real consequences. Evelyn Cross arrived at EO 548 on the 3rd of November, 14 minutes ahead of schedule. She drove a beige 4-door sedan with 63,000 miles on it and a side mirror that had been cracked and repaired with electrical tape. She parked in the visitor's lot because her base access credentials hadn't cleared through the system yet, which was not a problem. She carried 1 bag out of the car, a single strap over her left shoulder. She didn't look around the way most new arrivals did, the instinctive survey of an unfamiliar place. She looked forward. She knew the layout already. The duty sergeant at the gate was a heavy-set man named Broder, who had worked the same 0500 rotation for 6 years and had developed the refined skill of processing paperwork without engaging with the person attached to it. He stamped her transfer documents, slid them back under the window, and said, "Logistics Annex is Building 7. Morning briefings 0700. Bunk assignment comes through supply at 1400, assuming they've got their inventory together, which is about a 50-50 proposition." "Understood. Thank you, Sergeant." "Don't thank me yet. Half the heating in 7 runs on hope. Bring extra socks." She thanked him again. He looked up at that. Some people said thank you once out of politeness, but twice usually meant they meant it. And for a brief moment, he actually looked at her face. She was younger than he'd expected from the transfer documents. Early 30s, maybe. The kind of face that didn't give much away. Eyes that were paying attention to more than the immediate surface of things. He watched her walk toward Building 7 and then went back to his coffee and thought about it for approximately 3 seconds before the next vehicle pulled up. That was exactly how it was supposed to work. Building 7 was a 2-story concrete structure that smelled permanently of diesel and old paper. The logistics annex occupied the entire ground floor, a long open room divided by rows of metal desks, mismatched filing cabinets, and shelving units that groaned under binders nobody had touched in 2 procurement cycles. The inventory software was 12 years old. The monitors were a mixed generation of hardware that reflected a budget process that had prioritized other things. The fluorescent lights ran slightly warm on the left side of the room and slightly cold on the right, a distinction nobody had bothered to report because it fell into the category of things that were annoying but not worth the paperwork. Evelyn was assigned the desk near the back, beneath a window with a broken seal that let in a ribbon of cold air. She sat down, tested the chair's stability. It had a minor lean to the left, found it acceptable, and opened her assigned workload without commentary. Her job was to process transfer manifests, cross-reference fuel allocation logs, reconcile supply requisitions against delivery confirmations, and file reports in the format the system required. It was not glamorous, it was not meant to be. It was the kind of work that people performed in the background of larger institutional activity, the kind that made everything else function without being visible itself. She did it with the quiet, unhurried precision of someone who had done much harder things and found this manageable. Within 4 days, she knew the name of every person who worked in or regularly passed through her section of Building 7. She knew which ones arrived early and which ones left late. She knew who ate lunch at their desk and who went to the mess. She knew the 2 people who seemed to avoid the corridor near the records room, and she knew that one of them flinched slightly whenever a vehicle pulled up close to the building's front entrance. She collected none of this in writing. It all went into a part of her mind that she kept separate and organized, the way certain people keep a drawer that nobody else is allowed to open. Her direct supervisor in the logistics section was Staff Sergeant Pilar Odom, a compact woman in her mid-30s with close-cropped hair and the particular brand of controlled exhaustion that accumulates in people who are competent enough to see problems clearly and powerless enough that seeing them hasn't helped. Odom ran a tight section. She was fair in the specific way of someone who had been treated unfairly and decided deliberately not to reproduce it. She returned emails. She gave credit where it belonged. She covered for her people when they needed it without making them feel like they owed her. She was also sitting on something that was eating at her. On Evelyn's 5th morning, Odom came to her desk with a stack of fuel allocation summaries and set them down without the usual administrative preamble. "These are last cycle's numbers," she said, "and the cycle before that, and the one before that." Evelyn looked at the top sheet. "What am I looking at specifically?" "Discrepancy between reported fuel expenditure and actual consumption based on mileage and engine hours. It's not huge in any single month. It's consistent across 8 months." Evelyn turned to the second sheet. "You've flagged this before." "Twice. First time, Captain Hewitt told me to recheck my source data. I rechecked it. Same result. Second time, I sent it up through Kane's office. Got a response from his aide telling me the variance fell within acceptable operational parameters for a base of this size. Word for word? I wrote it down." Odom reached into the folder she was holding and produced a single sheet with a handwritten note at the bottom. She didn't hand it to Evelyn. She just held it where it was readable. "I've got the response email printed too." Evelyn looked at the numbers again. She turned to the third sheet, then the fourth. "These variances aren't distributed randomly. Random errors in consumption reporting scatter across categories. These concentrate in 2 vehicle classes and hold steady month over month." Odom was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yeah, I know. That's not a math error." Another moment of quiet. Odom pulled out the chair beside the desk and sat, which was not something supervisors did casually at Redstone Valley. It meant she was treating this as a conversation rather than a briefing. "I have 3 people in this section who've noticed pieces of it," she said. "None of them will put their name on anything, not after what happened to Kowalski." "Tell me about Kowalski." Odom looked at her steadily. "You've been here 5 days. You started this conversation. Tell me about Kowalski." Odom held her look for a moment, then looked at the window. Daria Kowalski, specialist, motor pool, filed a formal discrepancy report on vehicle maintenance records about a year ago. Equipment listed as serviced that hadn't been touched. Parts logged as replaced that were still original. She documented it carefully, went through proper channels. She paused. 6 weeks later, she was on a rotation order to a cold weather assignment in Montana. Framed as routine, completely by the book. The timing was just... She stopped. "Coincidental," Evelyn said. "Right. Who else?" Odom hesitated. Then, Corporal Brea, medical supply, and Lieutenant Albright, who used to run 2nd Platoon and now processes administrative forms in a room by herself for 8 hours a day. Evelyn set the fuel report down. "How long has Kane been commanding this base?" 4 years. And this pattern, the discrepancies, the reassignments, how far back does it go?" "Far as I can find." Odom stood. She picked up the fuel summaries, then put them back down on Evelyn's desk. "I'm going to leave these here, standard reference materials. You might need them for your allocation work." "Thank you, Staff Sergeant." Odom started walking away. She stopped after 3 steps and turned back, and her voice was very quiet. "You're not just here for the manifests." It was not a question. It barely had the shape of one. Evelyn looked up. "I process manifests, Staff Sergeant." Odom looked at her for one more moment. The look of a person who has been waiting a long time for something and isn't sure yet if this is it. And then she nodded once and left. Evelyn spent her evenings reading. Not the fuel reports. She'd already absorbed those. She read the personnel directory, the base organizational chart, the published inspection reports from the last 3 annual cycles, and every publicly available after-action summary from training exercises conducted under Kane's command. She read them in the break room with a cup of coffee, looking like someone trying to understand their new assignment, because that was exactly what a new logistics officer would do. What she was actually doing was mapping the structure. Kane at the center, Captain Hewitt managing the operational layer, the day-to-day enforcement of preferences disguised as policy. Major Rourke handling personnel and evaluations, which meant he controlled the tool Kane used most frequently. Lieutenant Marsh as the administrative interface, the voice that delivered Kane's decisions in the language of procedure so they arrived sanitized and deniable. It was not an unusual structure. She'd seen versions of it before. Corrupt institutional authority almost always built itself the same way. A center, a layer of translators, and a wide surrounding field of people who had learned to look away. The variation was in the details, the specific mechanisms, the paper trails and the gaps in them. She needed the gaps. She needed time. She gave herself time by being exactly what her transfer order said she was. January came with a cold front that dropped the temperature fast and held it there. 2 water mains in the maintenance bay failed within 48 hours of each other, and the base ran on reduced operational capacity, while repair crews worked in shifts around the clock. The disruption was real. It also created a legitimate reason for the logistics section to pull extended access to supply logs going back multiple procurement cycles, cross-referencing what had been requisitioned, what had been received, and what was currently on hand against the maintenance disruption's impact on base operations. Odom authorized the extended access through proper channels. Evelyn worked late. What she found underneath the fuel discrepancies was more deliberate than she'd initially assessed. The inflated fuel figures were a layer of camouflage. Beneath them was a pattern of requisition manipulation. Supply orders submitted at quantities that had exceeded documented operational need by margins that varied but averaged 15% across vehicle maintenance, medical supply, and communications equipment categories. The excess was not being returned to central supply, and it was not appearing as surplus in inventory records. The paperwork accounted for it as expended. The physical logs told a different story. She traced the approvals. Every inflated requisition moved through a 3-officer chain, different names at the bottom. The same name at the top of each chain's authorization structure. Marcus Kane had not signed a single one directly. He never did. That was the architecture. The distance was deliberate and maintained carefully. His signature appeared only on the summary-level approvals, the ones broad enough to be explained as routine command oversight. She needed the communications. She needed what happened before the paperwork, the conversations, and directives that instructed the layers beneath to build the numbers the way they did. Those were not in the logistics system. Those were in a different channel entirely. She noted what she had, documented its structure in a format that existed only in her memory, and kept working. Well, on the 14th of February, a Tuesday, no particular significance to the date, she was cross-referencing a vehicle maintenance allocation cycle when she heard footsteps in the corridor moving faster than the building's usual pace. She had been at Redstone Valley long enough to read Building 7's ambient sounds the way people read weather. The pace of boots told you things. Someone was moving with purpose. Someone was angry. She minimized the files she was working on and opened the manifest summary that was always one click away. Clean, standard, exactly what should be on a logistics officer's screen at this hour. Kane came through the door with Marsh half a step behind him, slightly too fast. The walk of a man who wanted to be somewhere else but was obligated to keep up. Kane's face was carrying something he hadn't resolved yet, a flush at the jaw. The folder in his hand held too tight. He stopped when he registered her at the desk. The room was otherwise empty. 2 other people had been there an hour ago. They were gone. Who authorized the extended shift in this section? Staff Sergeant Odom, sir. The maintenance bay water main disruptions created allocation backlogs across 3 cycles. Odom extended coverage to clear the queue. I didn't ask why. Odom authorized it, sir. Kane looked at her desk. The screen showed the manifest summary. Ordinary. His eyes moved across the surface of it without finding what he was looking for, if he was looking for anything specific. "Your name," he said. "Cross, sir. First Lieutenant. Logistics support." "How long?" "Since November, sir." He held his position and looked at her the way he looked at things he hadn't categorized yet. It was a particular look, not quite suspicion, not quite indifference. The look of someone whose system of reading people relied on their reaction to being watched, and who was getting no useful data from this one. "Future shift extensions get routed through Hewitt's office," he said. "That's the standing process. Make sure Odom knows." "I'll pass it along, sir." He stood there for one more beat, then he left. Marsh followed, nearly clipping the doorframe with his shoulder on the way out. Evelyn waited. She counted 90 seconds in her head, listening to the footsteps in the corridor. She heard them reach the end of the hall. She heard the stairwell door. She heard nothing after that. She opened the files. The confrontation that changed everything happened at 0900 on a Friday in the last week of February. Unit inspection. Main command hall. Standard formation. 400 soldiers in rows, command staff moving through, Kane at the front with his clipboard and his commentary. Evelyn stood in her assigned row. She was thinking about a specific gap she'd found in the procurement approval chain the night before, a 40-day window where the standard authorization signatures were missing and the requisitions had moved through anyway, when Kane stopped in front of her. She registered his presence and brought her attention forward. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her in the building that night in January, but in front of 400 people the dynamic was different. He had an audience. The look was sharper. "Cross," he said. "Sir?" "Your section submitted a maintenance allocation report last week." "Yes, sir." It contradicted Captain Hewitt's vehicle assessment for the same period. The report documented a discrepancy between Captain Hewitt's mileage figures and the motor pool's physical logs, sir. I used both source documents and noted where they diverged. The hall was very quiet in the way that large rooms get when everyone in them has stopped performing their secondary activity and is paying full attention to one thing. "You noted," Kane said, "where a superior officer's assessment diverged from a spreadsheet." "Where the assessment diverged from the physical logs, sir. The spreadsheet was the tool I used to compare them. AR 7110-2 requires documented discrepancy reporting when source materials conflict." The citation sat in the silence. Across the room, a staff sergeant near the wall stopped writing on his clipboard. Kane took one step forward. He was significantly taller than her, broad at the shoulders, and he used proximity as a tool, closed the distance in the particular way of someone who had learned that physical nearness communicated a thing that words couldn't always deliver cleanly. "You want to cite regulations to me," he said. Quiet. Not loud. The quiet was worse. "In my command hall. In front of my soldiers." "I'm providing the basis for the report, sir. I wasn't aware that was inappropriate." "Your report," he said, "is being withdrawn. Hewitt's assessment stands, effective this morning." "Sir, withdrawing the report doesn't resolve the discrepancy. It removes the record that the discrepancy exists. If there's an error in the physical logs, I'm happy to." "You're happy," he said, and something in his voice went flat in a way that produced a specific kind of stillness in the people around them. The stillness of people who know what comes next and are already bracing against it. He raised his right hand and struck her across the face. Open palm. Controlled. Not a blow that was designed to injure. It was designed to produce a specific outcome. The instant collapse of posture, the dropped chin, the hands coming up. The reflexive apology that would tell the room watching that the structure was still intact, that the authority was still absolute, that this junior officer who had just publicly cited regulations at him had understood her mistake. The sound was very clean in the silence. Her head moved left with the impact. She brought it back. Her lip was split at the corner. A thin line of blood tracked down toward her jaw. She did not touch it. Her hands were at her sides, exactly where they'd been before. She looked at him. Not defiant, not tearful, not performing anything. Her breathing was even and her eyes were steady, and her expression held the quality of someone who had already accounted for this moment and was simply present in it. The 400 people in that room were not breathing. "You do not cite regulations at me," Kane said, quieter than before. "You do not contradict my officers. You do not file documentation that undermines command authority at this installation." He held his position. "Are we clear?" 3 seconds. She held his eyes for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Yes, sir." 2 words. Flat, level. No apology contained in them. No lowering of anything. Kane stayed where he was for one more beat. Something moved behind his expression, not the satisfaction of a man who has re-established order. Something closer to the first small awareness that the ground beneath his feet might not be what he assumed it was. He turned away. "Dismissed," he said to the room. "All units." The formation broke. The room filled with movement and the release of held breath, and the careful, deliberate way that people move after witnessing something they aren't sure how to process. Nobody looked directly at Evelyn in the immediate radius around her, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Pilar Odom materialized at her shoulder within 30 seconds. Her voice was almost inaudible. "Are you okay?" "Yes." She stopped, restarted. In front of the entire formation. "I know." "You didn't." Odom searched for the end of that sentence and couldn't find one that fit. Most people would have apologized before he finished raising his hand. "I know." Odom looked at the blood on Evelyn's jaw. Then she looked at her face. Then she looked at the door Kane had just walked through. "Who are you?" she said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. The question of someone who has just watched something and understood that the explanation they had for the person standing beside them was no longer adequate. Evelyn said nothing. She walked toward the far exit. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and removed a handset. It was small and plain-clothed. Nothing in the Redstone Valley communications inventory. She pressed the transmit key once and spoke 3 numbers into it, quietly, without breaking stride. Then she returned it to her pocket and kept walking. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, a pair of vehicles with Federal Military Command markings came through the Redstone Valley main gate. Not base vehicles, not regional command, federal. The duty sergeant at the gate called it up to the command office immediately. Lieutenant Marsh answered the call. The credentials the arriving officers presented were above Kane's clearance level. Marsh went the particular color of someone who has just understood that the thing they were afraid of has arrived, and that they do not know yet how much of it they are in. In the main mess, a group of soldiers from Building 7's logistics section were eating lunch. One of them looked out the window at the federal vehicles pulling into the central courtyard. He nudged the person beside him. Neither of them said anything. In the records room on the second floor of Building 7, Pilar Odom stood at her window and watched the vehicles park. She watched the officers step out. She watched them walk toward the command building with the purposeful, unhurried pace of people who have full authority and know it. She had not felt it in so long that it took her a moment to identify it. Relief. Not resolution, not victory, just relief. The specific, fragile feeling of someone who has been holding a door closed against pressure for a very long time and has just heard footsteps on the other side that are finally coming to help hold it. She didn't know yet who had sent those vehicles. She didn't know yet what the next weeks would look like. But she stood at that window and watched, and for the first time in 8 months, she let herself believe that the thing she had been quietly waiting for had finally begun. Downstairs, Evelyn Cross walked out of Building 7's side entrance, crossed the courtyard at an unhurried pace, and headed toward the command building. The blood on her jaw had dried. She didn't bother wiping it off. The 2 federal vehicles sat in the central courtyard with their engines off, and their markings visible from every window on the south face of the command building. Nobody had told them to park there. They had simply chosen the most visible position available, which was itself a statement. Evelyn walked past them without slowing. The officers who had arrived in those vehicles were already inside. She could see through the glass doors of the command building that Marsh was standing in the lobby with the rigid posture of someone who has just been handed a document they don't know how to respond to. One of the federal officers, a woman in her 40s with a colonel's insignia and the kind of face that gave nothing away for free, was speaking to him in the measured, unhurried tone of someone who has all the time in the world and knows the person they're talking to does not. Evelyn did not go inside. She turned left at the building's edge and walked toward the far side of the administrative complex, past the vehicle bay and the communications annex, to a gray exterior door that required a key card she wasn't supposed to have for another 3 weeks. The card she used was thinner than the standard-issue Redstone Valley credential and had no base insignia on it. The door opened. She went in. The room on the other side was small and used for storage. Surplus office furniture stacked against one wall, boxes of outdated training materials, a table that someone had dragged in and never dragged back out. There was a secure landline on the table that was not connected to the base communications network. She had used it 4 times in the past 3 months. This would be the 5th. She picked up the handset and dialed from memory. It rang twice. Cross. The voice on the other end was male, unhurried, the voice of someone who had been awake for a long time and had stopped performing energy several hours ago. "They're on the ground," she said. "We know. Voss checked in from the gate 20 minutes ago." Kane wasn't in the building when they arrived. His aide was. A pause. "Where is he?" "I don't know yet. He left the command hall after the inspection. I didn't have eyes on him after that." "We'll locate him. Your job right now is to stay in your lane." "I understand." Cross. The voice shifted slightly, the way voices do when the speaker decides to say something they've been deciding whether to say. "The inspection incident. Voss briefed me." She said nothing. "You're okay." It was not a question. It was a confirmation he was looking for. "I'm fine," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at the stacked furniture against the wall. A broken chair with one leg missing leaned against a filing cabinet. Someone had put a coffee mug on top of the cabinet and left it there long enough for the ring stain to set permanently into the metal. "I'm fine," she said again. "It went the way it needed to go." Another pause. Then, "The charges, when they come, will include that incident specifically. Every witness account we can document. You understand that?" "Yes." "It's going to get worse before the formal process starts. Kane still has authority on that base until the review is complete. He doesn't know yet what the review actually covers." "I know. Don't give him a reason to move against you outside of a public setting." "I won't." "Check in at 2200. The line went quiet. She set the handset down and stood in the storage room for a moment, not moving. The cold air from the poorly insulated wall was working its way through her jacket. The split at the corner of her mouth had stopped bleeding, but had stiffened into a small pull every time she moved her jaw. She pressed 2 fingers against it briefly, assessed it, let her hand drop. Then she went back to work. The base felt different by mid-afternoon. Not louder, actually quieter. The specific quiet that descends when 400 people are all processing the same information and none of them are sure yet what it means. The federal vehicles were still in the courtyard. Everyone had seen them. Nobody in the enlisted ranks had been told why they were there, which meant the explanation had already moved through the rumor network in 17 different versions, none of which were accurate and all of which shared one common thread. Something was happening that command hadn't announced. That thread alone was enough to change the texture of the day. Evelyn returned to Building 7, sat at her desk, and processed manifests. She did it at the same pace she always did. She answered 2 emails from Odom about allocation formatting. She filed 3 completed reports through the standard system. She drank half a cup of coffee that had gone cold and didn't bother replacing it. Around her, people were talking in the reduced volume way of people who want to talk, but are aware of who might be listening. "Federal Review," said Corporal Garrett at the desk 2 rows over, not to anyone specifically, just releasing it into the air. "Could be anything," said the specialist beside him. "Could be, but they didn't call ahead." "How do you know they didn't call ahead?" "Because Marsh looked like he was going to pass out." That part was accurate. Evelyn kept her eyes on her screen. Later, Odom came to her desk and stood there for a moment without speaking. It was her version of checking in. She looked at the dried blood on Evelyn's jaw and said nothing about it. "Kane's office called down an hour ago," she said. "Wants all fuel allocation summaries for the past 6 months pulled and compiled. Hard copies." Evelyn looked up. "Hewitt's request or Kane's directly?" "Marsh, on Kane's behalf." "Timeline?" "End of day." Evelyn held Odom's eyes for a moment. They both understood what this meant. Someone in Kane's orbit had figured out, or guessed, that the Federal Review might be looking at supply documentation, and the instinct was to get ahead of it, to have a prepared version of the records ready. "I'll handle it," Evelyn said. "I'll help." "No." She said it quietly. "I'll handle it. I need you somewhere else." Odom looked at her. "Where?" "I need you to go to the records room and pull the original physical logs for vehicle maintenance. Motor pool's copies, not the digitized versions. both sets. Put them in the section archive under routine maintenance cross-reference. Don't log it as a special request. Odom was quiet for 3 seconds. You're worried about something happening to them. I'm being careful. If someone sees me pulling those, it's a routine archive function. You do it twice a month. Evelyn. It was the first time Odom had used her first name. The informality of it was a measure of how seriously she was taking this. Whatever is happening right now, the federal people, the review, I need to know if I'm standing in the wrong place. Evelyn looked at her directly. You've been standing in the right place for 8 months. You've been standing there alone. That's not going to be the situation much longer. Odom held her gaze, searching it for something, reassurance or just the truth, which were not always the same thing. She nodded once and left. Evelyn turned to her screen, opened the fuel allocation database, and began compiling the summary Kane's office had requested. She compiled it accurately and completely, because accuracy was exactly what she wanted those records to show. Kane came back to the base at Sync 600. He came through the east vehicle entrance rather than the main gate, which was unusual. He parked in the command building's rear lot and entered through the side corridor. 2 officers who were near the entrance when he came in later described his face as controlled. Not angry, not afraid, controlled in the deliberate way of someone managing their expression consciously. He went directly to his office and closed the door. The Federal Review team was still in the building. Colonel Voss, the woman Evelyn had seen in the lobby, had established a temporary workspace in the base inspector's office, which was on the opposite end of the command building from Kane's. She had 3 personnel with her. They had asked for, and received, access to the base's shared document system. They had also asked for the inspection logs from the past 2 years and the procurement approval records from the same period. Marsh had provided all of it. He had called Captain Hewitt 3 times in the 20 minutes before he provided it. Hewitt had not answered the first 2 calls. On the 3rd, he answered and said, "Give them what they ask for. Document everything you give them." Then he ended the call. This information came to Evelyn through a channel that was not gossip. It was something more like the structural intelligence that accumulates when you have spent 4 months learning which people talk to which other people and under what circumstances. She had not recruited sources. She had simply paid attention in a building where very few people expected the new logistics officer to be paying attention to anything beyond her spreadsheets. At 17:30, she submitted the compiled fuel allocation summary to Marsh's inbox through the base document system. Accurate, complete, time-stamped. She packed her desk for the day, carried her bag out through Building 7's main entrance, and walked across the courtyard toward the enlisted quarters. The federal vehicles were still there. A light was on in the inspector's office on the command building's 2nd floor. Kane's office light was also on. She did not look at either window long enough to be noticed. The formal notification came the following morning. Kane delivered it himself, which surprised people. He could have sent Marsh, he could have sent Hewitt. The fact that he came in person to the 0700 logistics section briefing was itself a signal, though not everyone read it correctly. He stood at the front of the briefing room, a smaller space than the command hall, used for section-level meetings, with a whiteboard that still had someone's requisition calculation on it from 3 days ago. And he looked at the assembled personnel with the expression of a man who has decided that the best response to pressure is to apply more pressure in return. Federal Command Review is a standard procedure, he said. It runs on a schedule, and it operates within defined parameters. It does not affect day-to-day operations, and it does not affect the chain of command at this installation. I'm telling you directly so there's no confusion from whatever you've been hearing in the corridors. He looked around the room. His eyes stopped on Evelyn for approximately 1 second longer than on anyone else. "Business as usual," he said. "Questions?" Nobody asked a question. This was normal. Questions in Kane's briefings carried a risk assessment that most people performed automatically and resolved in favor of silence. He left. After he was gone, the room didn't immediately decompress. People looked at their folders, at the whiteboard, at the floor. The particular silence of a group of people who have just been told not to be concerned and have found the instruction itself concerning. Corporal Brea, the soldier Odom had mentioned, the one who had reported the medical supply discrepancies, sat 3 seats to Evelyn's left. I was a quiet man in his late 20s with a wide forehead and the habit of chewing the end of his pen when he was thinking hard about something. He was chewing it now. After the room started moving again, he leaned slightly toward Evelyn. His voice was low enough that it didn't carry past the two of them. "Standard procedure," he said. He said that 3 times last year when Kowalski filed her report, right before she got her transfer orders. "I remember reading about that," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "You've only been here 3 months." "I read the section history when I arrived. It's useful context for the allocation work." He held her eyes for a moment. Then he looked away, turned the pen over in his hand, and said, "They're not going to find anything. He'll have moved whatever they're looking for." "When do you think he moved it?" Brea glanced at her sideways. It was a sharp glance, the look of someone who has just recalibrated their read on a conversation. "Yesterday afternoon," he said carefully. "Probably. Before or after he came back through the east entrance." The pen stopped moving in his hand. He looked at her fully. Something had shifted in his expression. The careful, cautious flatness that people at Redstone Valley had learned to maintain was still there, but something behind it had moved. "You noticed that," he said. "I was at my desk." "A lot of people were at their desks." Evelyn said nothing. Brea looked down at his folder. He opened it, flipped a page, and said very quietly, without looking up, "The medical supply discrepancies I reported 14 months ago. The original copies of my documentation. Not the digital versions. I kept paper copies, locked in my personal footlocker." He said nothing further. Evelyn looked at her own folder and turned a page. "That was smart," she said. "Oh." The insubordination charge arrived in writing on the 3rd day after the inspection. It came from Hewitt's office, formatted correctly on standard military administrative documentation, citing Evelyn's conduct during the February unit inspection as a violation of command authority protocols. The language was precise and careful and had clearly been reviewed before it was issued. It accused her of publicly contradicting a superior officer's official assessment, citing regulatory language in a disrespectful manner, and creating a disruption within the formation. It did not mention the strike. That absence was a calculation. If the documentation acknowledged the physical contact, it created a record that could be examined. The charge was designed to frame the incident as one-sided, a junior officer's insubordination, addressed appropriately by command authority, now being pursued through proper channels. Evelyn read it at her desk. She read it twice. Then she set it face down on the desk surface and sat for a moment. Odom appeared in her peripheral vision. "It's been going around the section. People know." "I assumed they would." "Hewitt's office doesn't issue those on its own. Kane drove that." "Yes." "You're going to fight it." "I'm going to respond to it through the appropriate process," Evelyn said, "which is what the regulation requires." Odom made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. "The appropriate process at this base goes through Rourke's office for personnel matters. Rourke has been in Kane's pocket since before I got here." "I know." "Then you know that the appropriate process here ends wherever Kane wants it to end." Evelyn looked at her. "Usually. Yes." Odom caught something in the way she said it. She opened her mouth and then closed it again. "I need to get back to the logs," Evelyn said, and she turned back to her screen. The meeting with Rourke happened 48 hours later. Major Dylan Rourke occupied a corner office in the personnel wing with a window view of the vehicle yard and a desk that was aggressively neat, the neatness of someone who spent time on the appearance of order because it communicated what he wanted it to communicate. He was in his late 40s, pale, with thinning hair he wore short to minimize the contrast, and the practiced ease of a man who had long ago become comfortable delivering bad news because he had learned to make it sound like reason. He gestured to the chair across from his desk when Evelyn entered, and he waited for her to sit before he spoke, which was a technique, making the other person settle, letting the silence do preliminary work. "Lieutenant Cross," he said, "I've reviewed Captain Hewitt's documentation. I wanted to give you the opportunity to respond directly before this moves to the formal disposition stage." "I appreciate that, sir." "Walk me through your perspective on the inspection incident." She did. She was factual and direct and did not editorialize. She described the exchange about the maintenance allocation report, the regulatory citation, and the physical strike in the same measured tone, as though they were all simply data points of equal weight. Rourke listened. He had a pen in his hand that he turned slowly as she spoke without writing anything. "The physical aspect of the incident," he said when she finished. "You're saying Colonel Kane struck you during the formation?" "Yes, sir." In front of 400 personnel. Yes, sir. He turned the pen. Lieutenant, I've been in the military for 22 years. I want to give you some honest guidance. He leaned forward slightly, adopting the posture of candor. What you're describing is a serious allegation against a colonel at a base he commands. The documentation process for that kind of allegation is significant, and the standard of evidence is substantial. More importantly, he paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. The people who pursue those processes tend to find that the process itself takes a toll on their records, on their assignments, on the trajectory of their career. He set the pen down. That's not a threat. That's an honest observation from someone who's seen it. Evelyn looked at him steadily. I understand, sir. Good. So here's what I'm recommending. He opened the folder on his desk. We document your response to the insubordination charge. I include a notation that you've acknowledged the concerns raised, and we close this out at the section level. You move forward. Kane moves forward. The Federal Review completes its standard cycle and wraps up. And this incident is behind everyone. He looked up. That's a reasonable path. It is, sir, she said. I'd like to include one thing in my documented response, if that's acceptable. Of course. A formal request that the incident during the inspection, specifically the physical contact, be included in any materials provided to the Federal Review team currently on base. The room went very still. Rourke's pen, which he'd picked back up, stopped moving. The Federal Review, he said carefully, is a procurement and administrative audit. It's not a conduct review. The scope of a federal command review under the relevant authorization can be expanded at the reviewing team's discretion, Evelyn said. I'd just like the incident documented and made available in case they determine it falls within their scope. That way there's no gap in the record. Rourke looked at her. He had stopped performing candor. What was behind it now was something more unprocessed. The expression of a man who has just looked at something from a different angle and found that the shape of it had changed. Where did you study military administrative law? He said. It came out almost involuntarily. I read a lot, sir. He looked at her for a long moment. I was reclassifying her. She could see it happening, the slight recalibration behind his eyes as the version of her he'd constructed over the last 2 minutes was adjusted to account for information that didn't fit the first version. I'll process your response, he said. His voice had lost some of its rehearsed ease. Anything else? No, sir. Thank you for your time. She stood, picked up her folder, and left. In the corridor outside his office, she walked at her normal pace. Her heart rate was slightly elevated, not from fear, from something more like precision. The feeling of having placed something exactly where it needed to go and knowing the next few seconds would determine whether it held. She turned the corner. At the end of the corridor, Colonel Voss was walking toward her with a personnel file under one arm. They passed each other. Neither of them made eye contact. Neither of them spoke. But as they passed, Voss's pace slowed by half a step, barely perceptible, and then resumed. It was enough. Well, that evening, Evelyn sat on the edge of her bunk in the quarters building and looked at the wall across from her. Her roommate, a Signal Corps lieutenant named Daria, who worked night shifts and communicated primarily in nods, was not there. The room was small and smelled like industrial laundry detergent and the particular staleness of a space with one small window. She had a notebook open on her knee. Not the kind with sensitive material in it. This was a plain commercial notebook she'd bought at the base exchange. She was writing out logistics scheduling notes for the following week's allocation cycle. Real work, necessary work. She would have to do it regardless of everything else. She had been doing this her entire assignment, performing the actual job while performing the investigation, because the job was not a cover story, it was the mechanism. The logistics section was where the evidence lived. You couldn't fake your way through the documentation work and expect to find the real pattern inside it. You had to actually do it. Her phone buzzed once, a text from a number that cycled every 72 hours. 4 words. Rourke called Kane. Flagged. She read it, set the phone face down on the mattress, went back to the notebook. She'd expected that. The moment she'd cited the Federal Review in Rourke's office, she'd known the information would move. That was the point. She needed Kane's circle to start making phone calls. Not because the calls would help them, but because calls left records, and records were what built the connective tissue between the individual incidents and the system that had generated them. She had not come to Redstone Valley to catch Marcus Kane making a mistake. She had come to build the complete picture of a structure that had been operating for years behind the language of proper procedure. Kane's mistake in the command hall, the open palm strike in front of 400 witnesses, had been a gift she hadn't asked for and had not planned around. It had accelerated the timeline. It had put something on the public record that was harder to manage than a spreadsheet discrepancy. But it was also why the next few days were going to be the most dangerous part of the assignment. Because Kane was not stupid. He was cornered, differently than he knew, but cornered. And cornered men with authority and resources and a practiced network of protection did not sit still. She closed the notebook. She looked at the wall. She thought about the three soldiers, Kowalski, Brea, Albright, who had each alone tried to do what she was here to do and had paid for it. None of them had had the full picture. None of them had had the clearance, the access, or the backing. They had just had a sense of what was wrong and the willingness to say it, and the base had absorbed that willingness and redirected it into isolation and paperwork and reassignment, and those three people had kept showing up every morning anyway. There was something about that she had not found a clean way to think about yet. She was still working on it. Her phone buzzed again. Same number. Kane meeting off base, 2100, vehicle ID to follow. She read it. Then she set the alarm on her watch for 2045 and lay back on the narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling and waited. Outside, the courtyard lights were on. Through the small window, she could see the edge of the command building's roof against the dark sky, and the faint trace of the federal vehicle's outline in the lot where they'd been parked for 3 days. Tomorrow, the federal team would be on base for 72 hours. By that point, Rourke's flag to Kane would have produced a response. She needed to know what kind. At 2058, a military-grade SUV with base markings left through the east vehicle entrance. Kane was in the passenger seat. The driver was a staff sergeant from the motor pool named Greer, who had been assigned to Kane's personal transport detail for 2 years. The vehicle turned south on the access road that ran alongside the base perimeter and continued toward the highway junction. A second vehicle followed at a distance that wasn't quite surveillance and wasn't quite coincidence. Inside the second vehicle, the federal team's lead investigator, a lean, deliberate man named Carver, who had been doing this specific kind of work for 11 years, drove with one hand on the wheel and his phone on the dash showing a passive track. He didn't call Evelyn. She had already told him what she expected to find. Kane was going to meet someone who was not on the base organizational chart, not in the procurement approval chain, and not in any file that had been submitted to the federal review team. Someone whose name Evelyn had found in the gap, the 40-day window in the approval chain where the signatures were missing and the requisitions had moved through anyway. She had identified the name 3 weeks ago. She had not put it in any report yet. She was waiting for Kane to confirm it for her. And at 2134, in the parking lot of a roadside diner 14 miles south of Redstone Valley, Marcus Kane got out of his vehicle and walked to a corner booth where a man in civilian clothes was already sitting with a cup of coffee and a very particular way of holding himself, the posture of someone who had once had a great deal of authority and had never fully adjusted to not having it in an official capacity. Carver photographed them from the parking lot. He sent the image with no text. Evelyn received it on the cycling numbers thread while she was sitting in the storage room with the secure landline. She looked at the image for a long time. The man in the civilian clothes was older than she'd anticipated. There were lines in his face that the personnel photograph she'd been working from hadn't fully captured. Retired General Richard Vale. She'd had his name for 3 weeks. Now she had him in a booth 14 miles south of the base, meeting with the man she had been building a case against for 4 months. On the same night that her formal documentation request had made it clear to Kane's inner circle that the federal review was not going to stay within its original parameters. She set the phone down on the table. The secure landline's receiver was cold in her hand when she picked it up. She dialed. 2 rings. Cross. Vale is confirmed, she said. He's with Kane right now. Carver has photographs. A silence on the other end that was not empty. It was the silence of someone recalibrating the timeline. That moves things, the voice said. Yes. How fast? She thought about Rourke's office, about the insubordination charge sitting in the personnel system, about Brea's paper copies in a footlocker, about Pilar Odom pulling physical maintenance logs into the section archive without logging it as a special request, About the 3 seconds she had held Marcus Kane's eyes in the command hall with blood drying on her jaw. "Fast enough," she said. The line went quiet after she said it. Not the quiet of someone who had nothing left to say. The quiet of someone on the other end of a secure channel in the middle of the night who was staring at a timeline that had just compressed by several days and was running the arithmetic on what that meant. "I need 24 hours to get the expansion authorization formalized," the voice said finally. "Once Vale is officially in scope, the review team's access changes. They can pull communications, not just procurement." "I know." "Cross, until that authorization comes through, you stay in your lane. Kane is going to come back from that diner and he's going to do something. He won't sit." "No, he won't." "Whatever he does, you document it and you do not engage outside your role." "Understood." "Understood." The line closed. She sat in the storage room for another minute, not moving. The secure landline made a faint electrical hum in the silence. Outside the small building, the base had gone to its nighttime rhythm. Reduced foot traffic, the distant sound of a generator running on the maintenance side, the occasional vehicle on the perimeter road. She thought about Vale's face in the photograph. The particular way he'd been holding his coffee cup. Not drinking it, just holding it, like a prop. Like a man who'd come to that diner to listen rather than talk. That was interesting. Men like Vale usually talked. They'd spent careers being the one who talked while everyone else listened, and the habit didn't die with the uniform. The fact that he'd come to listen meant Kane had called the meeting. Kane was scared enough to reach out first. That was a different shape than she'd expected, and she filed it away and went back to her quarters and slept for 5 hours, which was what she could get. Kane came back through the east entrance at 23:10. He did not go to his quarters. His office light came on at 23:18 and stayed on past midnight. Marsh arrived at the command building at 23:41, his personal vehicle, civilian clothes, clearly called in. A light went on in the administrative wing 40 minutes later, which was where Rourke's office was. Evelyn knew this because the base's exterior lighting system created a specific pattern of illuminated windows visible from the east-facing corridor of Building 7's second floor, and she had been standing in that corridor since 23:05, with a cup of cold water and nothing that looked like a reason to be there except insomnia, which was not unusual enough at a military installation to attract comment. She noted the windows and the sequence and went back to her bunk. In the morning, 3 things happened before 0800. First, Specialist Daria Kowalski received emergency transfer orders, canceling her Montana assignment and directing her to report to a federal command office in a city 3 states away. The orders came from above the base level. Marsh processed them without being consulted, which meant they had not been generated by Kane's office. He called Hewitt immediately. Hewitt did not answer. Second, a formal scope expansion notification arrived in Colonel Voss's temporary workspace, authorizing the review team to access base communications logs, personnel action records, and off-base contact documentation for the preceding 36 months. It was time-stamped 0614, which meant the authorization had been processed overnight. The 24 hours had become 14. Third, at 0743, First Lieutenant Evelyn Cross was summoned to the base commander's office. The summons came through Marsh in writing, formatted as an administrative request rather than an order, which was a specific choice. An order created a formal record with defined response protocols. A request was more ambiguous. It gave Kane more room. She read it at her desk, set it beside her keyboard, and finished the allocation report she was working on before she went. Kane's office was on the 3rd floor of the command building, corner position, with windows on 2 sides. It was a large room made to feel larger by the deliberate sparseness of its furnishing. A desk, 2 chairs across from it, a flag stand in the corner, a single-frame citation on the wall that you had to stand close to read. No photographs, no personal objects visible on the desk surface. The room communicated authority through what it withheld rather than what it displayed. Kane was standing when she entered. Not at his desk, at the window, looking out over the central courtyard, and he stayed at the window for a moment after she came in, which was another technique, making the other person wait in the room without acknowledging them, establishing the hierarchy of attention. She stood at ease and waited. He turned. He looked better than she expected, given that he'd been in his office past midnight. He'd slept somewhere in there, or at least rested. The flush from the previous days was gone. What was in his face now was more composed, more deliberate, the expression of a man who had decided overnight how he was going to approach this. "Lieutenant Cross," he said, "sit down." She sat. He moved to his desk but didn't sit behind it. He stood at its edge, one hand resting on the surface, the posture of someone who wants the desk's authority without the barrier it creates. "I want to talk to you about the insubordination charge," he said. "Of course, sir." "And about your meeting with Major Rourke yesterday." "Yes, sir." He looked at her. "Rourke tells me you made a request to have the inspection incident forwarded to the Federal Review Team." "I made a request to have it documented and made available, sir, in the event the team determined it was within their scope. The Federal Review is a procurement audit. I'm aware of what it was originally scoped for, sir." The word originally sat between them. Kane's hand, resting on the desk, moved slightly. A small adjustment, barely visible, the kind of involuntary shift that happens when someone's body registers a hit that their expression is working to conceal. "You're a logistics officer," he said. "First lieutenant. You've been at this installation for 4 months." "Yes, sir." "And you feel comfortable making administrative requests that reference ongoing federal reviews." "I felt it was the appropriate channel for documenting an incident that occurred in a public setting, sir. I wasn't comfortable with it being absent from any relevant record." He was quiet for a moment. He moved around the desk and sat in his chair. The switch from standing at the desk's edge to sitting behind it was another adjustment. He was trying positions, looking for the one that felt like it had the right leverage. "I'm going to be straightforward with you," he said. She waited. "The charge from Hewitt's office is going to be withdrawn," he said. "I've decided it creates more administrative noise than it resolves. The inspection incident, what happened between us, I'm going to characterize it in any documentation as a training correction that was misread by personnel unfamiliar with command culture at this installation. That's the cleanest resolution." She looked at him. "In exchange," he continued, "your request to Rourke gets withdrawn. The incident doesn't go into the federal record. We close it out at the section level, exactly the way Rourke originally recommended." He leaned back slightly. Not relaxed. It was a performance of relaxation. "That's a reasonable offer," he said. "Better than reasonable, given the charge on the table." Evelyn held his gaze for a moment. "Sir," she said, "with respect, what you're describing is an exchange where I withdraw a formal documentation request in return for having a charge dropped that shouldn't have been filed. That's not a resolution. That's a trade." Kane's jaw tightened, just slightly. "That's a practical outcome." "I understand that's how you're framing it, sir. I'm not in a position to accept it." The room was very quiet. "Not in a position," he said. "No, sir." He looked at her for a long time. Not the flat look from the command hall. Something more focused than that. He was trying to read her, trying to find the calculation behind what she was doing, the career calculation, the risk assessment, the personal leverage point that could be found if he looked hard enough at any junior officer who was behaving in a way that didn't fit the expected pattern. He wasn't finding it. "You understand what not accepting it means," he said, "for your assignment here, for what comes next on your record." "I understand the environment I'm operating in, sir. Yes." He was quiet again. Then he said something that he probably hadn't planned to say, something that came from a place that was less managed than the rest of the conversation. "Who sent you here?" It was barely a question. It was an arriving conclusion delivered as a question, because delivering it as a statement would mean he was already certain, and certainty in that direction was a thing he wasn't ready to be certain about. She met his eyes. "I was transferred here from the Regional Logistics Command, sir. It's in my personnel file." He looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he said very quietly, "Get out of my office." She stood, picked up her folder, and left. What? The next 18 hours moved fast, in the way that situations move fast when multiple things are developing in parallel and none of them are waiting for the others. Voss's team, working with the expanded authorization, pulled 36 months of base communication logs and began the process of cross-referencing outgoing contact records with the procurement approval timeline. It was painstaking work, and it would take days to process fully, but within the first 4 hours they had flagged 43 communications between Kane's office and an external contact number that did not appear in any base directory. They ran the number. It came back to a consulting firm registered in a state 300 miles away. The firm's listed principals included a name that appeared nowhere in the military system, but appeared in 2 property records and a corporate filing alongside the name of Richard Vale's eldest son. Carver brought this to Voss at 1400. She looked at the filing for 40 seconds without speaking. Then she said, "Get me everything on the firm. Every transaction, every contract, every correspondence reference." She paused. "And get me Cross." Carver looked at her. "She's still active cover." "I know what she is. Get her here without making it visible." The meeting happened in the base inspector's office at 1520, routed through a supply delivery request that gave Evelyn a documented reason to be in the command building. She came in through the side entrance, went up the stairs to the 2nd floor, and knocked on the inspector's office door. Voss opened it herself. The office was small for the number of people in it. Voss, Carver, and a young analyst named Webb, who was working on a laptop with an external drive attached. The desk was covered in printed documents, organized in a system that was clear to the people who'd built it and opaque to anyone else. The original inspector's belongings had been pushed to the periphery to make room. Voss closed the door. She did not waste time. "Vale's connection is confirmed through a corporate structure," she said. "Shell 2 layers deep. The consulting firm has received 11 payments from base procurement accounts over 26 months. Total value is substantial. The payments are coded as technical support contracts for logistics software." "The base runs 12-year-old inventory software," Evelyn said. "Yes. There are no corresponding service records, no documentation of any technical support being provided. The contracts exist on paper, and the payments moved, and that's it." Evelyn looked at the documents on the desk. She could read the top layer of them from where she was standing. "The payment authorization chain," she said. "Does it go through Kane directly?" "1 layer removed. Hewitt authorized 3 of them. Rourke authorized 4. The remaining 4 were processed through a temporary contract officer who was only at this installation for 90 days and has since separated from the service." "Convenient. Very." Voss looked at her directly. "Cross, I need to know what you have that isn't in the materials you've already submitted, not a summary, specifically." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. This was the decision point she had been moving toward for 4 months. Not a dramatic moment. It didn't feel dramatic from the inside. It felt like a calculation performed under mild time pressure with incomplete information, the way most real decisions felt. "I have a 40-day gap in the procurement approval chain," she said. "Requisitions that moved without proper authorization signatures. The gap runs from month 14 to month 15 of Kane's command, which corresponds to a period when the base inspector's position was vacant between appointments. We found the same gap. In that gap, there are 7 requisitions. Total value approximately 230,000. They were all processed by a single clerk, a specialist named Harmon, who has since been promoted to corporal and is currently assigned to the motor pool." Voss glanced at Carver. He was already writing. "Harmon didn't generate those requisitions," Evelyn continued. "The language in the request matches Kane's administrative style in specific ways. Phrasing patterns, sentence structure in the justification fields. I've compared them against 36 months of documentation Kane's office produced. The match rate is significant." "You've been building a linguistic comparison," Voss said. "I've been reading carefully." Voss looked at her for a moment. Not reassessing. She had already assessed Evelyn correctly, weeks ago, which was why she was standing in this office right now. It was more the look of someone confirming that the thing they'd believed was the shape of the situation was, in fact, the shape of it. "I also have a name," Evelyn said. "A soldier at this base who documented medical supply discrepancies 14 months ago, filed a formal report, and kept paper copies of his original documentation separate from the digital records that were subsequently altered in the base system." Voss's expression didn't change. "Altered." Brea's original report and what currently appears in the base records system under his complaint case number are not the same document. The room was quiet except for the sound of Webb's fingers on the keyboard. "I need those paper copies," Voss said. "I know. He'll provide them voluntarily. He's been waiting for someone with actual authority to ask." "Can you arrange it without it going through Rourke's office?" "Yes." Voss nodded once. She picked up a document from the desk, looked at it briefly, and put it back down. "Kane met with you this morning?" "Yes." "He offered to drop the insubordination charge in exchange for withdrawing my documentation request." Yes. You declined. Yes. Voss looked at her. He's going to move against you now, not through channels. He's used the channels he has, and they're not working the way he expected. He'll try something more direct. I know. You're prepared for that. I've been prepared for that since November. Voss held her gaze for a moment. Then she said, the formal reclassification of your status goes through tonight. As of 0600 tomorrow, your cover assignment ends. You'll operate openly as Major Cross, attached to the review team. The rank landed in the room the way she'd always known it eventually would. Not as a revelation, because Voss already knew and Carver already knew. But Webb, the young analyst, stopped typing for approximately 2 seconds. His eyes moved to Evelyn's uniform, reading the insignia, and then moved back to his screen with the careful neutrality of someone recalibrating in real time. One more night, Evelyn said. One more night, Voss confirmed. Well, she found Bria at 1745 in the motor pool's side lot where he was performing a routine vehicle check on a transport truck that didn't need a routine vehicle check. He was the only person within 40 meters. She had timed her approach for exactly that reason. She walked to the truck's passenger side and stood with her back to the nearest camera angle. The paper copy's in your footlocker, she said, without preamble. Brea had a checklist in his hand. He didn't look up immediately. Yeah. I need them tonight, before 2200. He was quiet for a moment. He made a check mark on the list that corresponded to nothing. You going to tell me what's actually happening? A federal review team has confirmed that the records you filed a complaint about 14 months ago have been altered in the base system. Your original paper copies are now material evidence. He stopped making check marks. He looked at the side of the truck. 14 months, he said. Yes. I filed that report 14 months ago and somebody changed it, and nobody... He stopped. He pressed his lips together. He was not going to say what he was feeling because there wasn't a version of saying it that wouldn't embarrass him, and he knew it. Okay, he said. 2200. Where? Building 7. Side entrance. I'll be there. She left him standing beside the truck. At 1900, Kane called a meeting. Not a formal session. This was not announced through official channels. It was conveyed through Marsh, verbally, to Hewitt and Rourke, and 2 other officers from the command staff. They gathered in the small conference room on the 3rd floor, the one adjacent to Kane's office, and the door was closed. No agenda was circulated, no record was kept. Evelyn knew about it at 1917 through a source she had been cultivating since December. Not a recruited asset in any formal sense, just a person who had watched things happen at this base for long enough that they wanted someone to know what they were seeing. A clerk in the command building's administrative pool, a young private named Solace, who processed Marsh's scheduling calendar and had very good peripheral vision and a habit of staying late. Solace sent a text to a number that routed to Evelyn's cycling contact, 3rd floor, small conf, 5 officers, door closed, no calendar entry. Evelyn read it and thought about the timing. Kane was meeting with his inner circle the evening before her cover status changed. He didn't know about the 0600 reclassification. He didn't know what was in Voss's office. He knew the review had expanded its scope. He knew Evelyn had refused his offer. And he knew, from 22 years of institutional experience, that situations like this one had a window. A window before the formal process locked everything into place, before the documentation was too complete and the witnesses too protected, and the authorization chain too official to interrupt. He was deciding whether to act inside that window. She needed to know what he decided. At 2015, Marsh left the command building carrying a bag that he hadn't arrived with. He got into his personal vehicle and drove toward the base's residential quarters. Solace sent another text. Marsh left early. Took a bag from Kane's office. At 2031, Evelyn called Carver. Something's moving, she said. 3rd floor meeting, Kane and 4 command staff, no record. Marsh just left the building with a bag from Kane's office. Define bag. Document bag. Standard military. Carried it like it had weight. A pause. You think he's moving materials? I think he's being cautious. Kane knows the review's access expanded. If there's anything in his office that isn't in the base document system, physical documents, external drives, anything he's been holding separately, tonight is the last reasonable window to move it before Voss can request a physical records review. We can't intercept Marsh without authorization for a physical stop. I'm not asking you to intercept him. I'm asking you to document the movement. Time, location, vehicle, destination, whatever you can do within your current authorization. Done. A pause. Cross. Be careful tonight. She was already putting her jacket on. Well, the base at 22100 had the particular quality of a place where most people had stood down, but not everything had. Lights in the command building, lights in the federal team's workspace, the flat white glow of the motor pool's exterior floods. Evelyn moved through the residential area toward Building 7 at a pace that was normal enough not to register and direct enough not to suggest she was avoiding anything. She went in through the side entrance at 2050 and stood in the corridor. Brea arrived at 2057. He was in civilian clothes, off-duty, plausibly there for any number of reasons that had nothing to do with evidence transfer. He had a regulation-sized gym bag over one shoulder. He handed it to her without ceremony. "It's all in there," he said. "Everything I filed originally, and 2 things I didn't file." She looked at him. "What 2 things?" He shifted his weight. "After my report got killed, I kept watching. Couldn't help it. I documented 2 more cycles of medical supply discrepancies. Kept the paper copies. Didn't file anything because I figured..." He stopped. "I figured filing it would just make it disappear faster." "When did you document them?" 8 months ago, and 4 months ago. 4 months ago was 1 month after Evelyn arrived. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Because I didn't know what you were. And I've been wrong about people at this base before." That was fair. She didn't argue with it. "These will be entered into the federal record," she said. "Your name will be attached to them as the originating source." "I know." "It's going to draw attention." "I know that too." He adjusted the strap of his now empty bag. "I figured it would eventually. That's why I kept the copies." She nodded once. He left. She stood in the corridor with the gym bag and thought about the 14 months he'd carried those documents in a footlocker, going to work every day in a motor pool on a base where the system had absorbed his complaint and smoothed it over and kept running, and he'd kept his copies anyway, just in case, without knowing if the case would ever come. She picked up the bag and went upstairs. She was at her desk in Building 7 at 2140 when the door opened. She didn't hear it at first. She was reading, the gym bag on the floor beside her, Brea's documentation spread across the desk in organized sequence. She was cataloging it, cross-referencing it against her own timeline. The section was empty. She was the only one in the building at this hour. The footsteps in the corridor were not Odom's measured pace and not Brea's. She'd calibrated those already. These were heavier, 2 sets. She looked up from the desk. Hewitt came through the door first. Captain Dale Hewitt, Kane's operational enforcer, in uniform despite the hour, with the tight expression of a man on an errand he's not entirely comfortable with but is committed to. Behind him was a sergeant from the base security section named Doyle, big through the shoulders, 10 years of institutional muscle memory, the blank face of someone executing instructions without interrogating them. Hewitt stopped when he saw the documents on the desk. He looked at them. He looked at her. "Lieutenant Cross," he said, "you're in this building late." "I had work to finish, sir." "Collect your things. I'm escorting you to the command building. Colonel Kane wants to speak with you." She held his eyes. "It's 2140, sir. Is this a formal summons?" "It's a request from your base commander." "At a 2140, without written documentation." "Lieutenant, sir, I'd like to understand the basis for the request. Is this connected to the insubordination charge? Because that charge is currently under review, and I've been advised by Major Rourke's office to route any related communications." "This isn't about the charge." Hewitt's voice dropped a register. The performance of patience was gone. "Collect your things. Now." She looked at him, then at Doyle. Doyle had his hands at his sides, not aggressive, just present, the posture of someone prepared to become a physical fact if the situation asked for it. She looked back at Hewitt. "I'd like to make a phone call first," she said. "You don't need to make a phone call." "I'd like to." "Cross?" He stepped forward and something in his voice changed. The administrative veneer stripped all the way down, leaving something rawer and more direct underneath. "Stop making this complicated. Come with us. Whatever you think is happening here, it isn't. Kane wants to talk. That's it." She looked at him for a long moment. The documents were on the desk. The gym bag was on the floor. The door behind Hewitt and Doyle was the only exit from this section. 72 hours ago, she would have had no good option. But it was not 72 hours ago. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a handset. Not the logistics radio. A different one, darker, smaller, with a frequency range that had nothing to do with Redstone Valley's communications network. She pressed the transmit key once. A voice answered immediately. Copy. Building 7, second floor. I have 2 personnel requesting to escort me off premises without written authorization. A pause of approximately 4 seconds. Stay where you are. 3 minutes. She set the handset on the desk. Hewitt was looking at the handset with an expression that had stopped being controlled. It was the expression of a man who has just watched someone make a move he didn't know was on the board. What is that? He said. She didn't answer. Doyle shifted his weight. He looked at Hewitt. Hewitt looked at the handset. Then he looked at Evelyn with the specific, arriving look of someone who is watching a picture they thought they understood rearrange itself into something they don't recognize. Who did you just call? Hewitt said. The 3 minutes passed in silence. At exactly the 2-minute 50-second mark, boots on the staircase. Not one set. 4. Moving with the particular cadence of people who are not in a hurry because they do not need to be in a hurry. The door opened. Carver came in first, followed by 2 federal personnel in full identification. Behind them was a base security officer, not Doyle's rank, significantly above it, with a face that suggested she was not pleased to be pulled to Building 7 at 21:43 on a weeknight. Carver looked at Hewitt. He looked at Doyle. He looked at the desk covered in documents. He looked at the gym bag on the floor. His expression registered all of it without becoming theatrical about any of it. He said to Hewitt very calmly, "Captain, step back from the desk." Hewitt did not move immediately. He was doing the same calculation that all of them did eventually. The one where you measure how much authority you actually have against how much you've been operating as though you have, and you find the gap, and you stand in it for a moment before you decide what to do next. He stepped back. Carver looked at Evelyn. He looked at the documents. Are those what I think they are? Corporal Bria's original medical supply documentation, she said, including 2 cycles that were never formally filed. Carver crouched, looked at the top page of the gym bag contents without touching it, and stood back up. Good, he said simply. Then he looked at Hewitt again. Captain Dale Hewitt, you are being placed under a federal command hold pending review of your conduct in connection with an ongoing investigation. That means you don't leave this installation, you don't contact Colonel Kane or Major Rourke, and you don't access any base documentation systems. He paused. Do you understand what I just told you? Hewitt's face had gone through 3 different versions of itself in the last 90 seconds. The one it settled on was the face of a man who has finally stopped calculating because the math has stopped working. I understand, he said. The room had the particular stillness of a moment that has just become irreversible. Doyle was looking at the floor. The base security officer was on her radio. Carver was documenting with a small recorder he'd taken from his pocket. The federal personnel had positioned themselves in the room with the quiet, practiced efficiency of people who did this regularly enough not to make it dramatic. Evelyn looked at the documents on her desk. She looked at the gym bag. She began carefully, methodically, placing Brea's documentation back into its organized sequence. Her hands were steady. Outside the window, across this courtyard, Kane's office light was still on. It would be on for another 40 minutes, and then it would go off, and the base commander's vehicle would exit through the east entrance, and by the time anyone formally registered the departure, the window that Kane had been calculating would have closed, not because he'd missed it, but because there had never been a window. There had only ever been the case, and the case was complete. Kane's office light went off at 2024. Carver was watching the command building's south face from the inspector's office window when it happened. He noted the time, radioed the gate, and was told, 40 seconds later, that the base commander's vehicle had already cleared the east entrance. Whoever was monitoring that exit had not flagged the departure in real time. He stood at the window for a moment, then he picked up his radio and said, "Expand the perimeter. He's mobile." The next 6 hours belonged to the kind of institutional machinery that moves slowly when it has time and very fast when it doesn't. Voss authorized a formal departure notification to Regional Command at 2241. Regional Command escalated to federal level at 2309. By 0155, Kane's personal vehicle had been located via a tollway camera 47 miles south of Redstone Valley, heading toward a private airstrip that served a flight charter operation registered to a holding company that was, when examined closely, registered to the same state as Vale's consulting structure. He was not running randomly. He had a destination, which meant he had a plan, which meant the meeting at the diner had been more operational than it looked. Evelyn was in the inspector's office when the tollway image came through. She looked at it on Carver's laptop, at the grainy timestamp and the familiar profile of Kane's vehicle in the right lane doing exactly the speed limit, and she thought about the coffee cup in Vale's hand. The prop. The man who had come to listen. He gave him an exit route, she said. Carver nodded. Looks like. Vale's been doing this a long time. He'd have contingencies built. We're running the airstrip now. If there's a flight plan filed, there won't be. She straightened up from the laptop. He won't use a registered aircraft. He'll use a private arrangement, someone Vale has used before. She paused. Pull Vale's travel records for the last 3 years. Look for recurring private charter use. The same operator will come up more than once. Carver looked at her. That's a significant data pull at this hour. Webb can run it. Webb, who had been on his laptop continuously for the better part of 6 hours and was running on something that was probably not adequate nutrition, looked up and said, I can run it. Carver pulled out his phone. Evelyn walked to the window. The courtyard below was quiet. 2 base security personnel were visible near the command building's main entrance, positioned there since Hewitt had been placed on hold 2 hours ago. The federal vehicles were still in their spots. The base had the particular suspended quality of a place where something large had happened and the aftermath hadn't fully arrived yet. She was tired. Not the dramatic exhaustion of a person at the end of their limit, just the plain accumulated tiredness of 4 months of continuous operational alertness. The kind that settles into the backs of your shoulders and the base of your skull and doesn't announce itself loudly, just sits there. She pressed 2 fingers against the corner of her mouth. The split had healed to a thin line. Still tender if she pushed on it, she stopped pushing on it. At Yo314, Webb found the charter operator, a small aviation company operating out of 3 regional airstrips across 2 states, used by Vale on 4 separate occasions over 30 months, always paid through a business account connected to a third entity in the corporate structure that took 40 minutes of document cross-referencing to link back to Vale himself. The company had 1 aircraft currently in use, a 6-seat turboprop that had filed no flight plan but had logged a fuel purchase at a private strip 61 miles from Redstone Valley at 2347. Carver put the airstrip location into a federal intercept request at 0318. The aircraft was on the ground when federal personnel arrived at 0341. Kane was in the passenger seat. He had not made it to wherever Vale had intended him to go. He had been on the ground for 11 minutes, which suggested either a mechanical delay or a communication failure somewhere in the chain. He was sitting in the seat with his hands in his lap, and the expression of a man who has been running a calculation for the last 4 hours and has arrived, finally, at an answer he doesn't like. When the federal officers opened the aircraft door, he did not argue. He looked at the lead officer and said, I want a JAG representative. You'll have one, the lead officer said. Now. As soon as we're back on base, Colonel. He got out of the aircraft. The news reached Redstone Valley at 0400 through the formal notification chain. Voss to Base Security Command, Base Security to the Duty Officer to the NCO structure. By 0500, it had moved through the informal network that runs parallel to every formal one, faster and less accurate, but covering the same territory. By 0600, when the PA system announced a mandatory all-hands formation at 0800, every person on that base already knew the outline. The details came later. Evelyn was summoned to the inspector's office at 0630. She had slept for approximately 90 minutes on the small couch in the file room adjacent to her workspace, which was not enough and was what was available. She arrived with coffee she'd made in the break room and the slightly compressed look of someone who has been awake too long but is functioning. Voss was at the desk. Carver was against the wall. A third person was present who had not been there before. A man in his mid-50s named Hollister, introduced by Voss as the Regional Command Liaison, which was a title that covered a range of actual functions. He had the careful eyes of someone whose job involved managing the gap between what had happened and what the institution needed to be able to say had happened. "Sit down, Major," Voss said. The rank landed in the room differently than it had the evening before. Then it had been a reclassification. Now it was just what she was. She sat. "Kane is in custody," Voss said. "Hewitt is on hold." Rourke turned himself in voluntarily at 0445. He called the duty officer and asked to be placed under federal hold, which I take to mean he's already spoken to a lawyer and decided that cooperation is his best position. "Marsh?" Evelyn said. "Still processing. He's not going anywhere." Voss folded her hands on the desk. "The materials from your Building 7 workspace have been entered into evidence. Brea's documentation has been reviewed and is consistent with your assessment. The digital records in the base system were altered. We have the original and the altered version, and they are materially different." "The alteration timestamp," Evelyn said. 14 days after Brea filed his original complaint, which is 9 days after Kane's aide, Marsh, acknowledged receipt of the complaint through official channels. She paused. "The timing is not subtle." "It never is, once you're looking at it straight." Hollister spoke for the first time. His voice was measured in the way of someone who had been in rooms like this one many times and had learned to speak carefully because what he said was going to be quoted somewhere eventually. "Major Cross, I'd like to go through the timeline of your assignment here for the formal record." He had a folder open in front of him. "You were embedded at Redstone Valley beginning November 3rd. Your operational authorization came from the Special Command Review Division under Colonel Voss's oversight. The cover identity, First Lieutenant Cross, Logistics Specialist, was constructed to allow you to operate within the base's documentation system without triggering Kane's established pattern of removing personnel who appeared to threaten his position." "That's accurate." "You identified the fuel allocation discrepancies within your first week." "I identified that they existed and that they had a pattern. I didn't have the structural picture yet." "Walk me through how you got there." She walked him through it. She was factual and linear, and she gave him the sequence without editorializing. The fuel reports, the Kowalski, Brea, and Albright records, the requisition chain, the 40-day approval gap, the linguistic comparison, the veil connection through the corporate structure. She did it in the order she'd assembled it, because the order mattered. It showed that the picture had been built from evidence rather than constructed backward from a conclusion. Hollister took notes. He asked 3 clarifying questions, all of which were sharp, and went directly to the points where the evidentiary chain was most reliant on inference rather than documentation. She answered each one directly, including the 2 where her answer was some version of "that's where the documentation ends and the pattern begins," and I distinguished between those throughout the process. He looked at her after the 3rd one. "You're careful about the line between what you can prove and what you can demonstrate." "They're not the same thing. The case depends on not confusing them." He made a note. "The inspection incident," he said. "February, the physical contact." "Yes." "You didn't report it through base channels." "Reporting it through base channels would have gone to Rourke's office. I've just explained what Rourke's office does with documentation that's inconvenient to Kane. You reported it to Colonel Voss's team directly." "I signaled that it had occurred." "Yes." "And you declined Kane's offer to bury it in exchange for withdrawing your documentation request." "I declined his offer, yes." Hollister looked at his folder for a moment. "That was a significant personal risk, Major. If the review had not expanded when it did, you would have been left in a position where a formal insubordination charge was on your record with no clean avenue to contest it." She looked at him steadily. "I know." "Were you confident the review would expand?" She thought about the honest answer to that question. She gave it. "I was confident the evidence warranted expansion. Whether the authorization would come through in the time frame I needed, no, I wasn't confident. I made the decision I made because it was the right decision, not because I was certain it would work out." Hollister looked at her. He wrote something in his folder. Then he closed it. "Thank you, Major," he said. "That's sufficient for now, Shab." The 0800 formation was conducted by the base's executive officer, a lieutenant colonel named Ferris who had been at Redstone Valley for 8 months and had the specific misfortune of being a competent officer inside a command structure that had no interest in competence. He stood at the front of the command hall and delivered a prepared statement, in the measured, controlled tone of someone reading words they didn't write about events they didn't cause. He informed the assembled personnel that Colonel Marcus Kane had been placed under federal investigative hold pending review of procurement and administrative conduct at the installation. That Captain Hewitt and Major Rourke were similarly placed. That the federal review team would remain on base until the investigative process was complete. That all personnel were expected to cooperate fully with any requests from the review team. That base operations would continue under his command authority, effective immediately. He did not mention Evelyn. He did not need to. The formation broke and the talking started, and within 20 minutes, the version of events that was circulating through the base was close enough to accurate to be functionally true. Kane was gone. Hewitt was gone. Rourke had walked himself into federal custody before dawn. The woman from logistics who'd been struck in the command hall in front of everyone. The one who hadn't apologized, who hadn't flinched, who'd cited AR 710-2 and then walked out of the hall and made a radio call, was apparently not a logistics officer. Pilar Odom heard it in the corridor outside the main mess at 0847. She was standing with a cup of coffee and someone told her, and she stood there for a moment with the cup in both hands looking at the middle distance. Then she walked back to Building 7 and sat at her desk and did not start her computer for approximately 4 minutes. She was still sitting there when Evelyn came in. Odom looked at her. At the insignia on her uniform, the Major's oak leaf, worn openly for the first time. Then she looked at her face. 4 months, Odom said. 4 months. You were here the whole time. I was here. Odom was quiet for a moment. The fuel reports I gave you, that first week, were the first solid evidence of a pattern, yes. And you couldn't tell me what you were doing with them. No. Odom looked at her desk. She turned her coffee cup between her palms. Kowalski's transfer got reversed last night. Montana orders canceled. I heard that this morning. Yes. And Albright. Albright's personnel action is under review. Her platoon assignment should be restored. Odom nodded slowly. She looked up. You knew about all 3 of them before you got here. I read their files. And you still needed to spend 4 months building the case. I needed a case that would hold, Evelyn said. Not an allegation, not a complaint. A documented, sourced, cross-referenced case with physical evidence and a witness record and an evidentiary chain that couldn't be managed or redirected. That takes time. Odom held her gaze. While he was still in command, while he could still do what he did. Yes. That's... Odom stopped. She started again. That's a hard way to operate. It is, Evelyn said, and she did not dress it up with anything, because it was true, and dressing it up would be a dishonesty that Odom didn't deserve. Odom looked at her cup. I pulled the physical maintenance logs into the section archive, the way you told me to. I know. Those have been entered into evidence. Good. She set the cup down. She looked at the window. Outside, the federal vehicles were still in the courtyard, though 2 of them had moved position since the morning. I have work to do, she said. So do I, Evelyn said. She went to her desk. She sat down. She opened her workload, and for a while they both worked in the quiet of a room that felt, for the first time in a long time, like a place where the work actually meant something. Vale was apprehended at 11:40. Not at a private airstrip and not in flight. He was at a hotel in a mid-sized city 4 hours from Redstone Valley, registered under a name that was not his, but connected to a credit account that took Webb 40 minutes to trace back through 2 layers of corporate structure. He was in the restaurant eating lunch when the federal officers arrived. He looked up from his plate and set his fork down with the deliberate calm of a man who had been expecting something like this for longer than he wanted to admit. He said, I'd like to make a phone call. The lead officer said, You'll have access to counsel, General. He stood and went with them and left his lunch on the table. The image came to Carver's phone at 02:03. He forwarded it to Evelyn without comment. She looked at it. The restaurant was visible in the background. White tablecloths, a lunch crowd, people at adjacent tables caught in various stages of their own conversations. None of them aware of what was happening at the table in the frame's left edge. Vale was upright, composed, walking beside the federal officer with the erect posture of someone who had spent 50 years in uniform and couldn't not. She set the phone down. Oh. The formal debrief with regional command happened at 1400. conducted via secure video link in the inspector's office. 3 senior officers on the screen, 2 of whom Evelyn knew by name, 1 she knew only by reputation. Voss was present. Hollister was present. Carver was in the back of the room. The debrief was thorough and not comfortable and was not supposed to be. The first 40 minutes covered the operational timeline, Evelyn's assignment, the evidence development, the decision points. The senior officers asked sharp questions about the inspection incident in particular, the way she'd managed the insubordination charge, and the decision to signal Voss's team rather than formally document through base channels immediately. She answered everything directly. The 40th minute brought the harder part. One of the senior officers, Brigadier General Marcia Tolliver, the one Evelyn knew only by reputation, a woman in her early 60s with the kind of face that had stopped being interested in performances of confidence because she'd been surrounded by them for too long, leaned forward toward her camera. "Major Cross," she said, walk me through the decision not to pull out when Kane struck you." The room on Evelyn's end got very quiet. She said, "What specifically would you like me to walk through, General?" "You had grounds to break cover at that point. Physical contact from a subject in a public setting. That's an escalation that would have justified immediate status disclosure under your operational parameters." "It would have justified it, yes." "But you didn't." "No." "Why?" Evelyn thought about the honest answer. She gave it. "Because if I disclosed status at that point, the case I had was a fraud allegation supported by spreadsheet analysis and one staff sergeant's verbal account of her prior complaints. Strong enough for a preliminary inquiry, not strong enough for the full structural case." She paused. "Kane would have been investigated for the procurement issues. Probably. He might have faced discipline, possibly. But the people above him in the network, Vale, the corporate structure, the shell payments, that disappears the moment Kane's lawyers start managing the process. You accepted a physical assault in order to protect the scope of the investigation. I assessed that disclosure at that point would compromise the outcome the investigation was designed to produce." Tolliver looked at her through the screen for a moment. Her expression was not warm. It was also not hostile. It was the expression of someone applying a very careful standard to a decision that could have gone wrong in several directions it didn't go. "That's a cold calculation," Tolliver said. "Yes, ma'am." "You were right about the outcome." "I was." "You could have been wrong." "I could have been. I made the best assessment I could with the information I had at the time." Tolliver was quiet for a moment. Then, the 400 witnesses in that hall, the soldiers who watched it happen and didn't know what to do with what they'd seen. "What about them, General? What do you think watching that did to them?" Evelyn held the camera. "I think it confirmed what they already knew about how authority operates at that installation. And I think what they watched happen in the 2 days after, Kane removed, Hewitt held, Rourke turning himself in before dawn, gave them a different data point about what happens when someone refuses to accept that authority as final." Tolliver held her gaze through the screen. "That's a generous read." "It might be. I'm not certain what they took from it. I can only control what actually happened." The general sat back. She looked at something off-screen for a moment, then looked back. "Your operational conduct throughout this assignment is being reviewed formally. That review will take time. In the interim, your commission status is confirmed at Major, effective the date of your original promotion, which your cover assignment required you to conceal." Evelyn absorbed that. The original promotion had been 14 months ago. "Understood," she said. "You have questions." 1. The soldiers who were retaliated against, Kowalski, Brea, Albright, their records, are under review. The negative performance notations, the personnel actions, will be addressed as part of the formal remediation process, yes. Timeline. Tolliver looked at her. "Major. I'm asking for a timeline, General. They've been carrying those records for over a year. It matters." A brief silence. Tolliver glanced at someone off screen. "We will target completion of the personnel remediation within 45 days. Thank you." The debrief ran another 20 minutes on procedural matters and then closed. The screen went dark. Voss looked at Evelyn. "You pushed Tolliver on the timeline." "She gave me one." "She doesn't usually." "Then I'm glad I asked." Voss picked up a folder from the desk. She held it for a moment without opening it. "There's something else. Kane's JAG representative made initial contact at 0900. Kane is requesting a formal interview, not an interrogation, not in the presence of investigators. He wants to speak with you directly. Evelyn looked at her. His word, through his representative, is that he has information about Vale's network that goes beyond what we've documented. He says he'll provide it, but he wants to provide it to you. Why me? His representative said, and I'm paraphrasing, that he wants to speak with the person who actually understands what they're looking at. The room was quiet. Evelyn thought about Kane at his desk the morning he'd offered to drop the insubordination charge. The flat look that went somewhere colder when she declined. The question he'd asked at the end that he hadn't meant to ask out loud. Who sent you here? He'd been trying to read her for 4 months and hadn't been able to. And now the case was built, and he was under federal hold, and his exit route had closed on the tarmac, and he was choosing, apparently, to talk. Not to the investigators with their recording equipment and their prosecutorial framework, to her. When? She said. Tomorrow morning, if you agree. She thought about it for a moment. Not long. I'll need Carver present and a recording. His representative will resist the recording. His representative can resist it, but I'm not walking into that room without one. Voss nodded. I'll communicate your terms. Icha. She found Bria at 1700 in the motor pool lot. He was at the same truck as the previous evening, doing the same check that still didn't need doing. She thought it might be a habit for him, something to stand next to when he was processing. She stopped a few feet away. They're going to come talk to you formally, she said. Probably tomorrow, the federal team. I figured. Your documentation is solid. The comparison between the original and the altered records is straightforward. You'll be asked to walk through when you filed, what you observed, why you kept the paper copies. I can do that. The performance notation on your record, the one about chain of command communication, it's being reviewed. He looked at the truck. They can review it all they want. I've had it for 14 months. I know. It's on every eval I've had since. Every review board that's looked at my file has seen it. He was quiet for a moment. You know what it's like to have something on your record that you know isn't accurate, but you can't argue because the person who put it there has more authority than you do. I have some idea, she said. He glanced at her. He knew about the insubordination charge. It had been circulating through the base like everything else. He looked at her insignia and looked away. What happens to Kane? He said. That depends on what his lawyers do and what he decides to say. But the charges are going to be significant. Procurement fraud, abuse of authority, obstruction. The physical contact at the inspection is part of the formal complaint. He'll get a reduced deal. They always do. She didn't tell him he was wrong because she didn't know that he was. The evidence is strong. Voss is thorough. What the outcome looks like will depend on how the process runs, and that part isn't mine to control. He was quiet for a moment, then, Vale. In custody. He processed that. He turned the pen over in his hand, the same pen she noticed, from the briefing room that morning. He'd been carrying it all day without realizing it. I filed that report 14 months ago, he said. I walked into the right office with the right documentation, and I did everything right. He stopped. He looked at the ground for a moment. And then I watched it disappear, and I got a notation on my record, and Kowalski got sent to Montana, and I thought... He stopped again. She waited. I thought maybe that was just how it was, he said. You know, how it worked. The people with the authority do what they want with the people who don't have it, and the system is supposed to protect you, but actually it protects them, and you live with that, or you leave. You didn't leave, she said. No. You kept the copies. He looked at the pen in his hand. He closed his fingers around it. Yeah. She held that for a moment. Then she said, that mattered. Whatever the next steps look like, what you did mattered. I want you to actually hear that. He looked at her. He was not a man who absorbed things like that easily. He sat with it for a moment, the way a person does when something lands that they've needed to hear and they're not sure what to do with the receiving of it. He nodded once. She left him there. The interview with Kane happened the next morning at 0900 in a secure room in the command building, 2 floors below his former office. He came in with his JAG representative, a lean, efficient attorney named Gould, who had the polished competence of someone who had spent years managing exactly these kinds of situations. and sat across the table from Evelyn and Carver and the recording equipment that Gould had objected to formally and then accepted. Kane looked different. Not broken. That wasn't the word. Smaller, maybe. Not physically, but in some way that was harder to define. The particular scale he had occupied in every room he'd entered at Redstone Valley for 4 years had been produced partly by authority and partly by the willingness of everyone around him to treat that authority as absolute. In this room, with those conditions removed, what was left was a man in his 50s with deep lines around his eyes and the careful stillness of someone who had decided, overnight, to stop spending energy on the performance. He looked at Evelyn across the table. "Major Cross," he said. He tried the rank out. Something moved in his expression. "Colonel Kane," she said. Gould said, "My client has agreed to provide information regarding the extended network involved in the Redstone Valley procurement irregularities in exchange for consideration of a cooperation agreement. This conversation is preliminary and does not constitute a formal proffer." "Understood," Carver said. Kane looked at the recorder. Then he looked at Evelyn. "Vale has 3 other installations," he said. "Not Redstone Valley's structure exactly. Variations. Same principle, inflated procurement, shell contractors, payment routing through legitimate-looking corporate entities. Different bases, different commanding officers, different timelines." Evelyn held his gaze. "How long have you known about the others?" "From the beginning. Vale brought me in through an existing structure. Redstone Valley wasn't the first. I was told it was part of a system that had been running for a decade without getting touched." "And you believed him?" Kane was quiet for a moment. "I believed that it had run for a decade. Yes." "Names," Carver said. "The other installations. The commanding officers." "That's what I'm here to give you." Kane glanced at Gould. Gould nodded once. Kane looked back at Evelyn. "But I want to understand something first." She waited. "The 4 months, he said. "You were here for 4 months, sitting in Building 7, processing manifests, and building that case." He paused. "I looked at you in January when you were working late. I looked at your screen. I looked right at you." "Yes." "And I didn't see it." She said nothing. "I need to know," he said. "Not for any legal reason. I just—" He stopped. He pressed his lips together. "I looked right at you and I didn't see it. I want to know how." She looked at him across the table. At the man who had struck her in front of 400 people because he couldn't find a thing wrong with her that he could express in words and needed to find something. At the man who had looked at her in Building 7 in January and seen a spreadsheet and a mild face and nothing else. "You were looking for fear," she said. "Everyone you looked at, you were reading for fear. It told you whether you had control of them." She paused. "I wasn't afraid of you. So your read came back empty and you moved on." Kane was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The other installations, 3 of them. I'll give you the full structure." He started talking. Carver's recorder ran. Outside the window of the secure room, the courtyard was going about its morning. Soldiers crossing between buildings. A vehicle pulling into the maintenance bay. The ordinary texture of a base returning slowly to something like its actual function after 4 years of operating around a distortion it had learned to treat as normal. Evelyn listened and asked her questions and did not take her eyes off Kane as he laid out the architecture of a system that had assumed, for a decade, that it would never be this fully seen. It was wrong about that. It had been wrong about that since the morning a beige sedan pulled into the visitor's lot with 63,000 miles on it, and a cracked mirror. And a woman with a single bag walked toward Building 7 without looking around. Kane talked for 3 hours and 14 minutes. He did not perform remorse. That was the thing Evelyn noticed most. He did not construct a version of events in which he was a secondary figure, or a reluctant participant, or a man who had simply made one bad decision that cascaded. He gave the architecture the way an engineer gives a blueprint, clearly, in sequence, without editorializing. The 3 other installations. The commanding officers. The contractor shell structure Vale had been running since before Evelyn had made major. The payment routing. The names of 2 people inside Regional Command who had received consideration for ensuring that certain audit cycles stayed narrow. It was more than she'd expected, not more than she'd hoped for. She had known, from the moment she'd traced the 40-day approval gap, that Redstone Valley was not the whole picture. But knowing the shape of something and hearing it confirmed in full, in a recorded room by the man who had been one of its functioning parts, were different experiences. She let him finish each section before she asked the next question. She did not interrupt. She did not react visibly when something landed that was worse than the version she'd constructed. Carver was very still beside her for most of it. At 12:14, Kane's JAG representative called a recess. Gould leaned toward his client and spoke quietly for 2 minutes. Kane listened. He nodded once. He looked at the table. When the session resumed, he signed the preliminary cooperation documentation that Carver had prepared. Then he looked at Evelyn one more time. "The other installations," he said. "The officers running them. They're going to know something happened here before your team gets to them. Vale will have—" He stopped. He reconsidered his assumption. Vale was in custody. He knew that. Or whoever Vale has left running communications will push a signal. "We've accounted for that," she said. "How fast can you move?" "Fast enough." He held her eyes for a moment. Then he looked at the recorder, at the folder of signed documentation on the table, at the institutional machinery of consequence that was, for the first time in his career, pointed at him rather than available to him. He said nothing else. Gould closed the folder. The session ended. The 3 additional installations were moved on within 72 hours. Evelyn was not part of those operations directly. Her assignment was Redstone Valley, and the case that had been built there, and the expansion to the broader network belonged to teams that operated out of a different office. But she received the confirmation notifications as they came through Voss's secure channel, one by one over the course of 3 days, and she read each one at her desk in Building 7 between allocation reports she was still responsible for filing because the base still needed to function and the work did not stop because the structure above it had been dismantled. The first notification came on a Thursday afternoon. She read it, set her phone face down, and went back to the manifest she was cross-referencing. The second came on Friday morning. She read it on the way to the mess and ate her breakfast and didn't talk about it. The third came on Sunday at 0800. She read it standing in the corridor outside her quarters and stood there for a moment with the phone in her hand, looking at the gray wall across from her, before she put the phone away and went to do her laundry. 3 installations. 3 commanding officers under federal hold. 2 regional command figures flagged for investigation. The shell company structure Vale had been running for a decade, being dismantled by a forensic accounting team that Webb had joined on temporary attachment, which meant Webb was somewhere doing what he was very good at and was probably running on even less sleep than he'd been surviving on at Redstone Valley. Vale himself remained in federal custody. His attorney had entered an initial plea posture that was going to take months to resolve. The cooperation agreement that Kane had signed would be a factor in that resolution, which meant Kane's decision in that recorded room had consequences that would ripple forward in ways neither of them could fully predict. That was the nature of these things. They didn't end cleanly. They settled, over time, into whatever shape the process produced, and the process was imperfect and slow and subject to the pressures that imperfect, slow processes were always subject to. Evelyn knew this. She had known it before she drove a beige sedan into the visitor's lot in November. Knowing it didn't make it feel better. It just made it accurate. The formal personnel remediation notifications went out on day 38 of the promised 45. Specialist Daria Kowalski's service record was corrected. The falsified performance notation was removed and replaced with an official correction memo, documenting that the prior notation had been improperly generated in retaliation for legitimate misconduct reporting. Her Montana transfer was formally classified as a retaliatory action rather than a routine rotation, and the classification itself went into the permanent record of the Redstone Valley Command Review, which meant it could not be quietly disappeared. She received her notification at the cold weather station she'd been assigned to for the better part of a year. The duty officer brought it to her in person, which was the protocol for formal record corrections. She read it standing outside the administration building with the Montana sky going gray above her, and she read it twice, and then she folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her jacket and went back inside to finish her shift because the work did not stop. She cried in the shower that night. She was not embarrassed about that. First Lieutenant Raina Albright received her platoon assignment back on day 39. She was brought into the new base commander's office. Ferris had been formally appointed to the position, which was imperfect because Ferris was adequate rather than exceptional. But adequate was an enormous improvement over what had been there, and handed the restoration order in person. Ferris was professional about it. He said the right things. She thanked him without warmth, because what she felt toward the institution at that moment was not warm, and she was not going to perform warmth she didn't have. She walked back to her old platoon's training area and stood at its edge for a long moment, and the soldiers there noticed her standing there, and there was a collective shift in the group's posture. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just the quiet recognition of a person returning to a place they should not have been removed from. She went to work. Corporal Thomas Brea's record correction was the most extensive. The chain of command communication notation was removed. The complaint case was redocumented with the original materials reinstated. An official record was added noting that the digital alteration of his original complaint had been confirmed as misconduct by the personnel responsible. His performance evaluations for the preceding 14 months were flagged for re-review under corrected circumstances. He received the notification on a Tuesday and did not tell anyone about it for the rest of that day. He went through his shift in the motor pool, did his work, ate dinner, and went back to his quarters. He sat on the edge of his bunk and read the notification 3 more times, and felt something that took him a while to identify because he hadn't felt it in so long. Something that was not relief exactly. Something closer to the feeling of a weight being confirmed as real. Being told, in official language, that the thing you had been carrying was not imaginary, that it had existed, that what happened to you had actually happened, that you had not been wrong. It was a strange thing to need confirmed. It was also, he found, very necessary. Evelyn's last official week at Redstone Valley was administrative in the way that endings usually were: documentation, handoff briefings, the transfer of ongoing case materials to the regional office that would manage the next phase of the review. She worked through it the way she worked through everything, methodically and without ceremony. On her third to last day, she sat across from Pilar Odom in the Building 7 break room at 1500 with bad coffee and the particular ease of 2 people who have been through something together and don't need to explain it to each other. Odom had been given a formal commendation for her role in preserving the physical documentation. It had been processed through the new command structure and was sitting in Odom's personnel file. Odom had read it once, put it away, and not mentioned it since. "You knew from the first week," Odom said. "I knew something was wrong from the first week. I knew the shape of the thing from the first month. The full picture took longer. But you knew the fuel reports were what they were. I knew they were the surface of something. Yes." Odom turned her cup. "And you sat there and processed manifests for 4 months. That was the job. That was your cover." "Both," Evelyn said. "It was both. The manifests needed to be processed. The base needs its documentation to function. Doing the actual job was part of how I found the evidence." Odom considered that. Most people couldn't do that, sit on what they knew. It wasn't sitting on it, it was building it. She paused. There's a difference. Sitting on something means you know what it is and you're waiting. Building it means you're not done yet. Odom looked at her. "Where do you go after this?" "I don't know yet. Another assignment. Different base, different problem." She looked at the coffee in her cup. "Same general territory. You do this a lot. Enough. And nobody ever knows who you are. Until they do, or until the assignment ends, whichever comes first." Odom was quiet for a moment. "Does it—" She stopped, started again. "Does it get to you, doing it the way you do it?" Evelyn thought about the honest answer. "Sometimes, not in the way you might think. It's not the isolation that gets difficult." She looked at the window. "It's the waiting. Knowing that something is happening and that the people it's happening to don't know yet that it's going to stop. That's the hard part. Watching it and not being able to tell anyone it's going to be different." "Kowalski," Odom said. "Montana." "Kowalski." "Yes, and Brea's notation sitting on his record while I was still building the case." She paused. "And you. 8 months of flagging those fuel reports and being told to recheck your math." Odom looked at her. "You knew about the fuel reports before you arrived." "I knew there had been complaints. I didn't know how far you'd pushed it or how carefully you'd documented it." She set her cup down. "You did more than you needed to. You kept records you didn't have to keep, and you kept raising it in forms where it kept getting shut down and you didn't stop." "For what it was worth," Odom said dryly, "it was worth a significant amount. Your documentation was part of what allowed the timeline to be established. Without the pattern you'd already mapped, building the procurement chain would have taken another month, minimum. She held Odom's gaze. I want you to know that, not as a formality, actually. Odom was quiet. She was not someone who received things like that gracefully. She absorbed them sideways, looking away, giving herself room to feel something without performing the feeling. She looked at the window for a moment. You're going to go somewhere else, she said, and do this again. Probably. Different name on the transfer order? Something like that. Same cracked mirror on the car? Evelyn looked at her. Something almost like amusement crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. That's my car, she said. The mirror is actually mine. Odom laughed. It was a short laugh, slightly surprised at itself. It was the first time Evelyn had heard her laugh, and it changed the texture of the room briefly into something easier. Then it passed, and they sat with their bad coffee in the quiet of Building 7 on an afternoon that felt like the specific kind of afternoon that happens just before something ends. She found Brea in the motor pool on her second-to-last day. He was not doing a fake vehicle check this time. He was doing an actual one, running down a maintenance list on a transport with a legitimate mechanical issue, kneeling beside the front wheel with a flashlight and the focused expression of someone who knows what they're looking for. He heard her coming and looked up without surprise. She stopped a few feet away. I'm leaving Thursday, she said. I heard. Your testimony will be taken by deposition before the formal proceedings. Carver's team has your contact information. Yeah, they called yesterday. He stood, brushed dust from his knee. I'll cooperate, whatever they need. I know you will. He looked at her. The afternoon light was flat and cold, the kind of February light that refused to do anything warm. His breath fogged slightly in the air between them. The notation's gone, he said. Yes. I looked at my file this morning, just to check that it was actually gone. It is. He nodded slowly. He looked at the truck for a moment. You know what's strange? I've been thinking about filing that original report for a year. What I should have done differently. Whether I should have gone around Hewitt instead of through him. Whether I should have made copies earlier. Whether any of it would have changed anything. Would different decisions have changed the outcome? That's what I keep asking myself. What do you think? He was quiet for a moment. I think I did what I could with what I had, and what I had wasn't enough to fix it by myself. He paused. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with. No, she said, it isn't. But it's true. Yes. He looked at her. Thank you, he said. It came out simply, without the weight of formality. Just 2 words in the flat light of a February motor pool from a man who had been carrying a footlocker's worth of copies for over a year. She held it for a moment. You kept the copies, she said, when there was no reason to think they'd ever matter. That's not nothing. He looked away. He was not built for this kind of conversation, and they both knew it, and neither of them prolonged it beyond where it needed to go. She left him there. On her last morning, she stood on the training field at 0630. It was early enough that the base was still in its pre-shift quiet, the particular stillness of a large place between its nighttime and daytime rhythms, when the sky was going from black to gray and the lights in the buildings were outnumbered by the dark. The training field was empty. The ground was hard with February cold and her breath came out in steady, even clouds. She stood where the formation had stood on the morning in late February. Not exactly the spot. It was a large field, and she was standing approximately where her row had been, which was close enough. She looked at the front of the field where Kane had come through the formation. She looked at the ground. She had thought she would feel something definitive standing here. She had thought the geography of a significant moment would produce something clean and named. It didn't. It produced the mixed, incomplete feeling of something that was over but had not yet fully settled into the past tense. That took longer. It always did. She heard boots behind her. She did not turn immediately. She recognized the pace. Odom stopped a few feet away and stood beside her, looking at the same empty field. I figured you'd be out here, Odom said. Am I that predictable? Not usually, but some things you can call. They stood in the cold for a moment. The new command structure is going to take time to normalize, Evelyn said. Ferris is adequate. The culture Kane built doesn't disappear with Kane. It took 4 years to build, and it'll take longer than that to shift. The people who learn to operate inside it are still here. I know, Odom said. Soldiers who saw what happened are going to need to relearn what reporting actually looks like when it isn't used as a weapon against them. I know that too. It's going to be slow. Cross. Odom looked at her. I've been here through all of it. I don't need the briefing. Evelyn looked at her. I know you don't. They stood there. You're worried about leaving, Odom said. Not accusing, just reading. Evelyn thought about denying it and decided against it. It's a reflex. Every assignment. Wondering what happens after the formal structure moves on. What usually happens? Varies. Sometimes the culture shifts faster than you'd expect. Sometimes it slides back toward what it was. Sometimes something different develops that's better, and sometimes it's just different. She looked at the field. I don't get to know which one it's going to be. That's the part you carry. Odom was quiet for a moment. I'll still be here. I know. And Brea. And Albright when she's back in her platoon. She paused. We know what it looks like now. The structure, how it builds. What to watch for. That matters, Evelyn said. More than you might think. Is that the official debrief statement, or do you actually believe it? Both, Evelyn said. Same as everything else. Odom made a small sound. Not quite a laugh. The kind of sound a person makes when something lands true in a way they weren't braced for. A door on the far side of the field opened, and two soldiers came out for early PT, talking at the volume of people who think they're alone. They noticed the two women standing on the field, and the volume dropped. One of them looked twice at Evelyn, at the insignia, at the face, putting together information that had been circulating through the base for days. And then they continued to the far edge of the field and began their warm-up. Evelyn watched them for a moment. She thought about the morning in February when 400 people had stood in this field and watched something happen and not known what to do with it. And she thought about the days after. The federal vehicles in the courtyard, Kane going flat in his office, Hewitt's face in Building 7, Rourke calling the duty officer before dawn to turn himself in. The way information moves through an institution when the thing holding it in a particular shape is removed. The way people adjust their posture when the pressure that was producing one kind of behavior is gone. It was not a transformation. She was not naive enough to call it that. It was an adjustment. A reset to something that had existed before Kane and would need active work to maintain after him. But the reset was real. The soldiers running their PT on the far edge of the field in the early morning light were running it in a different institution than they'd been running it in 2 weeks ago, and most of them probably couldn't articulate exactly what was different, but they would feel it, in small ways over time. In which conversations they were willing to have and in which rooms and at what volume. That was how it worked, slowly, imperfectly, without ceremony. She picked up her bag. I have a ZO-900 transport, she said. Odom nodded. She looked at the field, not at Evelyn. You should go. Yes. She walked toward the east side of the base where the transport lot was. She did not look back at the training field. She did not look at Building 7's windows or the command building's south face or the courtyard where the federal vehicles had sat for a week. She had a bag and a ZO-900 transport and another assignment that would come through in the form of 4 lines on a transfer order that nobody would look at twice. The formal disposition of Marcus Kane took 7 months. He pleaded to 8 counts of procurement fraud, 3 counts of abuse of authority, 1 count of obstruction, and 1 count of conduct unbecoming. The last one specifically for the incident in the command hall in February. His cooperation agreement resulted in a sentence reduction, but the reduction had limits and the charges had weight, and the final outcome was not the negotiated disappearance that men like him had historically been able to arrange. He was stripped of his rank. He was separated from the service. He served time. Richard Vale's case took longer. The layers of corporate structure and the decades of accumulated legal insulation made the process slower and more contested. But the forensic accounting was thorough, and the cooperation from Kane and 2 of the other installation commanders was extensive, and the outcome, when it came, was unambiguous. Vale was convicted on 12 counts across 2 jurisdictions. The consulting firm was dissolved. The corporate entities were stripped. The son whose name appeared in the property records and corporate filings was investigated separately, and the investigation produced its own results, which took still longer and generated still more proceedings. It was not clean. None of it was clean. It was the grinding, imperfect, slow machinery of institutional accountability, doing what it was capable of doing when the evidence was complete and the people responsible for building it had done their jobs without flinching. Hewitt cooperated partially. His cooperation was valued accordingly. Rourke cooperated fully, earlier than anyone else, and his outcome reflected that. Marsh, the aide who had gone pale in the lobby when the federal credentials were presented, and who had carried a bag of documents out of the command building on a night that turned out to be documented by 3 separate channels. Marsh was 26 years old and had been at Redstone Valley for 8 months when Kane recruited him for the administrative support he needed. His lawyer argued successfully that he was a junior officer who had operated under institutional duress without full knowledge of the network he was serving. The argument was partially correct. His outcome was the most lenient of the command structure's inner circle, and he left the service quietly and went to work for an accounting firm in a mid-sized city, and by all available evidence, did not look back. Pilar Odom was promoted to Master Sergeant 11 months after Evelyn left Redstone Valley. The promotion board that reviewed her record found it straightforward. Her documentation had been commended at the federal level, her performance metrics were strong, and the prior cycles during which her advancement had been quietly stalled were identifiable now for what they had been. She accepted the promotion in the way she accepted most things, without fanfare, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has stopped expecting things to be fair and has just been reminded that occasionally they are anyway. She kept running Building 7's logistics section with the same standards she'd always maintained. She answered her emails. She gave credit where it belonged. She covered for her people when they needed it. She stayed. Daria Kowalski returned from Montana and was reassigned to a base 2 states from Redstone Valley that had, as far as anyone could determine, a functional command structure. She joined the motor pool there and within 6 months had filed her first formal maintenance discrepancy report through proper channels and received a standard acknowledgement within the regulatory time frame and no subsequent transfer orders. She still found that slightly remarkable. Raina Albright led her platoon through a full training cycle that spring. She was direct with her soldiers in the way of someone who has been on the receiving end of institutional dishonesty and has decided that transparency is the only workable alternative. Some of them found her intensity difficult. Most of them found it, over time, something they could trust. Tomas Brea was promoted to sergeant the following year. He served as an NCO with the particular quality of someone who knows what it feels like to have the system fail you, and has decided that the appropriate response is to be the version of the system that doesn't. He still carried a pen in his pocket everywhere he went. He was still not sure why. Evelyn Cross received her next assignment 9 days after she left Redstone Valley. 4 lines on her transfer order. Different base, different specialty listed, different name in the cover identity. The problem the assignment was designed to address was different in its specifics and recognizable in its structure. The same shape of thing, in a different place, at a different stage. She read it at a desk in a regional command building 3 states away, sitting in a chair that had a slight lean to the right, which she noted and found acceptable. She had a new bag. 1 strap, over her left shoulder, broken in enough not to be conspicuous. She drove a different car. The cracked mirror had been replaced. She thought about replacing it back to cracked for a moment, and then decided that was too much. She pulled the transfer order's 4th page, the one with the base layout and the organizational chart, and looked at it for a while. She identified the people she needed to know about before she arrived. She read the notations in the logistics section's public records and found the pattern that had been flagged 3 times in 2 years, and each time redirected through a channel that went nowhere. She thought about the soldiers at that base who were carrying things they weren't sure would ever matter. She folded the page, she put it in her bag, and she drove. There is a particular kind of strength that makes no noise. It does not announce itself. It does not need anyone to know it exists. It works in plain sight, in ordinary rooms, through ordinary work. And it waits with the patience of someone who understands that the right moment is not the dramatic moment. It is the moment when the case is complete and the evidence is sound and the people who assumed they could not be touched find out, finally, that they were wrong. It is not perfect. It does not feel triumphant. It carries the weight of every day it had to wait, and the weight of every person it watched absorbed something they shouldn't have had to absorb, and it does not put that weight down easily. But it does not stop either. And that, in the end, is what the people who build their power on the assumption that nobody is watching have always failed to account for. Somebody is always watching. And sometimes the person they looked at and decided was nobody is exactly the person who was sent to make sure